Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to Reform Perspective. I'm Josiah Espinoza,
And I am Princess Espinoza.
and today we're going to be talking about a pretty controversial topic called transgenderism in the church, or the church's response to transgenderism. Before we get started, Princess is going to read Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 27 to kind of lay down a foundation.
Okay, so it says, Then God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them.
Yes. So good. So to start off, God created man and he created woman.
Mm-hmm.
And he created them to be men, males to be males, and females to be females. I mean, there's no other way around that. Regardless of what the world wants to say, that's just the way God created it. Now we live in a postmodernistic society, and a lot of so I'm gonna have to define terms and explain things as we go along, because baby boomers and even a lot of Gen Xers have a hard time trying to keep up with the whole millennial postmodernistic language that was created just recently, especially in terms of sexuality, gender, and assigned sex at birth. So the world wants to say that sex and gender are different. That when you're born with a specific sex. You're assigned a sex at birth. And that sex is based upon biological foundations, XY, XX chromosomes. Gender, however, is a social construct in the mind of the social justice warrior, in the mind of the postmodernistic millennial mindset, right? Gender is the idea that you can be as you claim to be, what you feel to be. So even though you were born a male at birth, you have the chromosomes that say you're a male. If later on you claim yourself to be something other than what you were assigned at birth, then that's what you are, because that's what gender is.
Yeah.
At least in the postmodernistic construct. Because in postmodernism, biology is a social construct.
Yeah.
Biology is just defined by whatever the hierarchical powers have defined it to be. And so it's irrelevant what your biological makeup is to the postmodernist. But to God, your biology is who you are, because that's who he designed you to be. Males are males and females are females, and he created them both in the image of God with equal value and with equal being created in the image of God equally. So that's where the human value comes into play, not based upon what society says about you, but what God says about you. And so me and Princess we actually talked about this a little bit last night, and I thought this would be a good topic. Yeah, especially because we know both of us, we're raising 4 children in this world.
Yeah.
We're raising 4 children in this reality, and I don't see it going anywhere. Do you have anything to say at all?
I see it going probably worse
Yeah.
than what it already is.
Yeah.
And it's not good. So.
Yeah, it's so transgenderism and the church. What is it that we're trying to do here? So what we want to do today is we want to try to first of all give you a perspective of how the world talks about this. So I'm going to play a clip from 2 individuals who are not Christians, not in the slightest, and I think they say one bad word in the clip. So if you have kids listening, just make sure that they're either not next to you, or you have the volume down lower so that they can't hear. But this is Joe Rogan and another individual, and they're talking about transgenderism, both in the athletic atmosphere and also for children. And this is an important topic.
Yeah.
Because understanding where this is going will help to better prepare the Christian to know how to respond when the time comes to it. Because, well, when we were talking, we got to a point where the ramifications could be catastrophic to the family, catastrophic to our freedoms, because we were trying to take it to its logical conclusion. And so we'll just start with the video and then interject whenever you feel so. And if you have questions out there, comments at all, go ahead and post them on Facebook. Princess will read them out loud, and then we're going to go from there. So here's the clip, and I'll try to stop the video periodically and define things and explain things as we go. But this should be a pretty good start to the video.
As far as trans athletes go, you know, we could sit here and talk for 3 hours about like all the different ways that hormones might affect your body and might not affect your body. And I'm not an expert on that. And I don't want to claim to be, right? But a sports with trans athletes who are competing with with their gender, right? That is a sporting world that I'm more interested in, right? And I think we should find a way to make that happen. I know it's going to be really complicated and messy, right? And there's going to be a lot of debate about it, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and there's going to be a lot of arguments. But I hope that that's the world that we move forward to.
Okay, so in his perspective, and what they're talking about here is a male who is born a male, who develops as a male, who gains the bone structure and the muscle density and all the weight and the power of a man, can take a few years, transition into a female, and compete in female sports. And according to him,
it should be okay.
It should be okay. Not only is it okay, he looks forward to a time where that becomes the normative way of looking at it.
Where to him, he believes that would be equality.
Right. Yes. And it's, of course, all of this is under the guise and mask of equality, in a sense of transgender people have the same, males and females have the same strength, the same physical traits, the same, everything's the same. Men are women, and women can be men, and nothing is different about them biologically, according to the extreme progressive liberal position.
So basically what you're saying is that if a man at the age of 30 decides to transition and he fully transitions into a female, that female should now have the equal opportunity to compete against other actual biological females, and it should be okay, and it should be considered equal because that male is now a female fully in his eyes.
Right. Yes. And not only in his eyes, but in the eyes of the society at large. And this has been the ongoing developing progressive mindset since the start of the sexual revolution in the 70s. Free sex, homosexuality, that has developed into what we are today. Even 15 years ago, the very concept or the idea of a man being in a female-dominated sport was considered outrageous. You wouldn't put a man in a female-dominated sport.
And vice versa. You wouldn't ever put a female in a male-exclusive sport or anything, because it's just not fair. It's not equal.
And we actually talked about this because I asked you a question, and I said, when do you think the physical differences between a man and a woman start to manifest themselves?
And I know that at a younger age, they already do manifest themselves, because if you compare a girl that is in the age of 5 years old versus a boy who is at the age of 5, I saw my boy he's always playing with a sister. He doesn't show very, very much of a male drive. He's not very competitive with her. He doesn't try to fight with her. I put him in the same class to do a Bible study. I was watching the kids, and he was put next to other boys his same age, and the first thing they started to do was to wrestle. And it was not a little a little tumble type of, they were literally attacking each other, throwing themselves down, and you could already see that at that young age. A girl, for the most part, would not do that.
And in our society, that's actually considered what's known as toxic masculinity. In
Which
the
is
eyes,
not. That's just
well,
a boy being a boy.
right. Well, the American Psychological Association has deemed masculinity, normal masculine development in that normal masculine traits, as being something that's toxic not only to the boy, but to the environment in which he's being raised, or to society at large, because those natural manifestations of boys being more aggressive by nature, of how they're designed by God, is actually considered to be toxic in the eyes of the progressive radical feminist and radical progressive liberal ideologies. And of course, those are fringe ideas. Those are fringe ideas. Those are not yet mainstream. But this is becoming mainstream.
Yeah. So continuing with the question you had asked me, at this young age, my son was 5 years at that time. And even though he doesn't try to ever overpower his sister, and I know he's a very strong boy,
Right.
but because he doesn't do those things, we can't really say, is he stronger than her already? Maybe. But I mean,
at this age, I don't think he is.
I don't think you ever actually really start to notice more of the aggressive side, more of the bone structure changing, more of the muscle growth, until they're going through puberty,
Right.
at the ages of like 10 through 12, 13, I think is usually when you start to see.
Yeah, eighth
more.
grade is when I started to see boys catching up to girls in terms of development and height and density, because from about kindergarten to 6th or 7th grade, boys are relatively smaller than girls, because girls mature a little faster. And so they develop breasts, they develop hip size a little bit sooner, they grow a little bit taller, a little bit faster than boys. But that's the natural progression of things. That's how God designed us to be. So when you see a 7-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl next to each other, sometimes the girl can look sometimes bigger, if not the same size as the boy. And so they create this narrative in society saying, well, girls can play tackle football with boys. And they always show around a 7 or 8-year-old girl. They won't show a fully formed girl out there tackling fully formed men, or not even in high school. And if they do, it's a very short clip of her making a small tackle or something, because they know that to a certain point, the biological traits of a man are going to fundamentally overpower the biological traits of a woman. Yeah. But that's the way God designed us.
Yeah.
And society, because they've removed God from the picture and they've allowed biological evolution and natural materialism to be the foundation in which they establish their entire reality, well, then it's only part of the evolutionary process that men become women and women become men. Because if, in fact, we are only natural, biologically evolved protoplasm, then it's irrelevant what our gender is, because it's just a social construct anyways. So that's what begins this idea, and this is actually becoming the mainstream. This is becoming the mainstream idea. 15 years ago, this would have been unheard of, but today that's the mainstream.
That's my point of view.
My point of view is that there's a reason, there's a distinction. There's a reason why we make the distinction to have male athletics versus female athletics. The reason is that males have a physiological advantage over women. So in most sports, most physical sports, we do not have males compete with females.
Now, Joe Rogan is not a conservative
at all.
He's not a Christian. He is a liberal. He advocates for drug use. He advocates for all kinds of things, and he is not the model of the Christian perspective.
No, he is not.
And it's amazing to me that he is the voice of reason in this scenario, and he's not the most profound voice of reason. He's just stating what's obvious,
What is fact?
what is obvious, what's commonsensical. And so I just wanted to point that out because if you go and listen to anything else Joe Rogan says, he's pretty much on the left or on the liberal side of things.
Question becomes, when someone who is male transitions and becomes female, do those same physiological advantages apply? And what is the evidence? Well, the evidence in competition seems to be that it shows that it does apply, particularly in weightlifting, rugby, mountain biking, power heavy sports that favor larger people, stronger bodies. Males that transition to females have a significant advantage, and they're breaking world records. So if you're a woman and you're a natural woman and you don't take any extra hormones or male hormones, you're not taking steroids or any sort of performance enhancing drugs, you're doing your very best to compete and you're at the top of the heap. But then someone comes along that was a man for 30 years and decides that they're going to be a woman, and this has happened, and literally transitioned a few months ago and competes as a woman and destroys records and dominates you in that sport. That's bullshit. And that's not competing on a level playing field. That's a person who is biologically a male and who is a male for 30 plus years of having testosterone run through their body and affect their tendon strength and affect the shape of their bones and the mechanical advantages of the male hips versus the female hips. And then they're competing with smaller people who have been a woman their whole life. It's not fair.
So, I mean, again, he's not a believer, so he says bad words. But so what his point is absolutely valid.
Yeah.
It's even when a woman takes massive amounts of testosterone or steroids, the physical capabilities of a man are always going to be, at least when it comes to the higher echelons of strength and agility and power, because there's some weak men. And I'm not saying that they're not men just because they can be weaker. Because
no, but in this case, he's talking about professional athletes.
Right,
so when you're talking about professional athletes, it's not going to be the weakest men. It's going to be the stronger men, the more agile men, the faster men.
But his point even is that even if a woman were to train her whole life, power lift, strengthening, agility, all the things that she can do, a man who is mediocre at the same thing can dominate her based upon their biological and physiological makeup. And that I agree with him. And yeah, that is messed up. That is messed up when a woman who has trained her whole life to become the best that she can be in her female dominated.
And she would have dominated if it would have been just women.
Like, for example, Serena Williams, she's a tennis player.
Yes.
One of the greatest tennis player of our generation, in the female aspect, and by the number of records and things she's broken, based upon just merit alone, she'd probably be even greater than the majority of the men. But she said, I think I could beat even men in the top brackets of the sport in tennis. And so a mediocre player who was like in the 400th place in men
went up against her and dominated her
because it's not the same.
It's
not the same. The hips are different. The shoulders are different. The power behind the swing is different. And tennis is not even that much more aggressive than other sports. Even golf. Men are going to be able to hit the ball further. They're going to be able to do things that other women, I mean, to a certain degree, golf is probably a little bit more equalized in that matter.
But even then, the way, for example, how he was saying the women carry more weight on their hips and their thighs and everything. Men don't have that weight. Men carry a lot of muscle through their thighs, through their arms, and to be able to transfer that power from their thighs to their arms, it's still going to make a huge difference.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Compared to a woman. So even on a more equal playing field, it still wouldn't be considered equal.
No, it wouldn't be considered equal. And it's preposterous to assume that men can be women and women can be men in all aspects, biologically and physiologically. And again, it's incredible to me that Joe Rogan is the voice of reason, because he's not the voice of reason when it comes to the majority of the topics that he talks about.
Yeah, but even going along with what you said, wasn't there an MMA fighter? What was her name?
Yeah, something Fox, I think. I forgot her name.
His
name, actually. So
well, no, the woman. She was
Oh,
her
yeah.
name Rachel.
I'm not sure what her name was.
I don't
but,
remember what her
yeah.
name was, but she was dominated MMA, and then there came a man who transgendered into female.
Yeah, he transitioned.
Transitioned into a female, and beat her to a pulp. She was
Right.
hospitalized, and she ended up coming out and saying that she wanted to commit suicide because that is what she did. She trained her whole life
Yeah.
to be the best MMA fighter, and then to have somebody come and just rip that away from her, it was devastating to her. And I feel for those women, because we are the first people to want to change the world.
Just bring the mic a little
Usually,
closer.
if there is a change, usually it starts because a woman wants to make that change, and we don't realize that by making those changes, we are basically messing everything up for ourselves.
Yeah.
We are the first ones to lose in all of this, and it's sad to say that we are seeing it now. This feminist movement, everything should be equal.
Yeah.
Then men transition to women, and they should be viewed as equal. And then they come and they just rip all of our.
Yeah, that's what something I've mentioned to you before is, it's sad to see that these feminist movements that have done real work in the past to try to equalize the rights of women in either voting or job opportunity or pay or things like that, are being treated equally in the work environment. I think those are all good things that should happen. But then here comes a man, puts on a dress, says, "Call me a she," changes his name, gets an operation, and then he becomes the standard of women. And he's supposed to have more rights than the woman. And that supersedes everything that women have accomplished within the last 100 to 150 years.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate that society is saying this is a good thing. This is a good thing. Well, we'll continue the video.
Is as much cheating as taking steroids when the other person doesn't, or taking performance enhancing drugs when the other person doesn't. Maybe even more so. Maybe even more so, because you also have, there's a bunch of advantages in terms of reaction time that males enjoy. It's some significant difference in reaction time between males and even untrained males versus female professional athletes.
Well, I disagree, and
What do you disagree about?
I've already my main point being the one that I already made, right? That
Again, this guy, he's far left from Joe Rogan, which is unfortunate. But
Which is
his
crazy.
voice is becoming the mainstream. His ideology, his position is becoming the mainstream ideology of our culture and our society today.
like, I don't think that there is such a thing as a perfectly level playing field. I think we decide what kind of playing field we want to have.
Sure, but we
and-
do make the
That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
He's basically saying, if I decide that cheating is okay, we should run with it. Because he's basically saying we can decide what our playing field is. So if I want to cheat, whatever I want to do, that's what we're going to do. And
that takes away the whole notion of competition in sport.
Yeah.
The whole point of sport is you're putting individuals together who are on the same playing field, or who are on the same
Exactly.
level. That's why they have major leagues, minor leagues, college level, high school level, because as soon as you put someone against the other,
it
it's
would
not
be
going to
like
even be a
putting
sport anymore.
Weight against a lightweight.
Yeah, or a featherweight. Yeah.
Featherweight. Yeah, like it should be equal because
Not-
they want it. It's
And not
like,
to say that the featherweight is not a good athlete, that he doesn't,
No, he
that he's not a good
absolutely
boxer or
does.
anything. I've seen tremendous fighters in the
Absolutely.
lightweight or featherweight, but to put someone like Mike Tyson against a featherweight would be ridiculous,
It would be-
and
it
nobody
be
would enjoy
basically
that.
saying like, I beat up a child. I am the strongest because I beat up a child, and it's like, what?
Yeah. It doesn't make any sense, and for some reason, society says, Well, putting a much weaker, lighter man against a much bigger, stronger man, that's unequal. But to put a man who calls himself a woman against a woman who is a woman, that's okay. And that's ridiculous. That takes away the whole notion of sport and competition.
Where we don't allow men to compete in women's divisions.
And I think that distinction may be breaking down a bit, right?
Why is it breaking down? According to whom? And you're going to see he assumes things already. Like you'll hear in his language and the way he talks, things are just assumed for him now, which is, again, that's becoming the normative. Homosexual marriage was not accepted until it just became the thing that was assumed. And now to go contrary to that narrative that's the same thing as a man and a woman being married is considered bigoted and against progressivism.
Well, I see where he's coming from because, like I said, we've seen this actually happen. We've seen sports where they allowed the men to infiltrate the women sport by transitioning. So in his eyes, because he's seen it before, I think he's basically saying, so it should be the norm now, which in our eyes is, why should it be considered?
Right. According to who? And they, of course, their authority is because that's where we're headed, or that's what progressivism is. And that totally assumes a worldview that is contrary to the majority worldview.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because this is the minority worldview, even though it's mainstream in the sense that those people in positions of power and of influence are the ones who are promulgating this idea. It's still not the majority position. So we'll just continue the video.
And I think it may be time to break down that distinction a little bit.
So you think that males should be able to compete in the women's division of weightlifting?
No, I don't necessarily.
But they can if they transition.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, there's a lot of stuff to break down, right? And I'm not an expert on the subject, right? So it's just sort of off the top of my head. One thing is, you're postulating a particular person who decided to transition at the age of 30, right? And they were very big and strong before.
Okay, so this is going to be, thank you. This is going to be one of the controversial things that he's going to say. So Joe Rogan's position is that men who have been men for decades should not be allowed to compete with women who have been women for decades. That just makes the most sense. And nothing should be contrary to that. That's just commonsensical. But what you're going to hear now is his position is it's okay for men to be competing in women's athletics so long as they transition from the earliest age possible.
Which is worse.
Yeah, of course it's worse. Anyways, we'll listen to what he says and then we'll talk about that because this is becoming mainstream, and to go against this narrative means to go against the state's idea of what it means to be a good parent. And this is the point we're going to get to eventually.
All right, and they decide to transition. Now, that is a type of person that exists, right? I think over the next certainly 30 years, we're going to see, now that people are starting to understand that being trans is just a way that people are, right?
See? You see that? That's just the way that people
How
are.
is it
Again,
the way that people are when majority of people are not trans?
they're just that's what's assumed. Just like they say, even today, it's to say a homosexual is not born a homosexual. That's something they choose. Is to go contrary to the assumed narrative already. We don't even talk about that anymore because that's a battle we've lost. We know we've lost that battle.
But even to say that's who people are homosexual, is this no, because not even the majority of people, even though that's acceptable now, not even then are the majority people homosexual.
I know, but the idea that that's who they are, that's just who they are. They're born that way. That's already assumed in culture and society at large. That is the majority voice now. It's increased in the church, it's increased in society, it's increased in the culture, it's increased in politics. To go contrary to that is to commit political and social suicide in this culture, in this day and age. So it's just assumed now.
Yeah.
They're just people who are trans, and this is something that we're going to accept and support, right? You're seeing folks transition much earlier age,
There's
Why?
but
and
then,
so if someone is
transitioning at an earlier and earlier age,
Because parents are starting to give in and starting to support their children, which in my mind, I'm like, that doesn't even make sense, because kids are not allowed, like, I think this is in the US, period, that you are not even allowed to buy cigarettes until you're 21.
right?
Not
No,
allowed
in California.
In California, at least, you're not allowed to buy cigarettes until you're 21. You're not allowed to drink till you're 21. Your what is that? The frontal
lobe.
lobe part of your brain doesn't develop until you're 25 years old is when you're usually is. And in my mind, I'm like, how are you going to take the word of a 3-year-old who's telling you, "Mommy, I was born a boy, but I want to be a girl," or vice versa? They have no idea what they're saying. Why would you shove pills down their throat when they see these things happening and they're confused? And instead of telling them, "No, honey, you're born a boy. That's what you are. You're a boy." Instead, they comfort them. They say, "Okay, this is your decision. Let's go to the doctor and shove some pills down your throat and have you transition, castrate yourself as soon as possible." And it's like, what?
Yeah, of course. I mean, well, the problem is, okay, so with what ended up happening with the baby boomer generation is they were part of the greatest, or they were the outcome of the greatest generation. That was the ones that came out of World War II. And so after the recovery of the economic status of the United States after the Great Depression, things were thriving, things were exploding economically. Those who were in abject poverty were now being able to sustain a family. So they were providing for their children, the baby boomers, things that they never could have themselves. Technology was advancing like crazy, and parenting changed in light of this new and transformed and explosion of economical wealth. Now take the baby boomer generation, and they're the ones who raised the Gen Xers and the millennials. And so they took that wealth and all that prosperity, and they raised children to the point to where they neglected discipline and responsibility, personal discipline and personal responsibility.
No, I think it was because they didn't have very much, so they wanted to provide everything their child wanted. Everything, whether it was money, emotional stability, anything. They just wanted their kid to be okay and to love them and to just give them whatever they wanted, basically. And the result of that is lack of discipline, lack of responsibility, lack of everything, basically. That is.
And well, as a millennial myself, I can talk about that, because there was a point where that idea that the world owed me something, the sense that they raised a generation of narcissists, right? Where the voice of the child was the dominant voice in the family. Parenting skills, disciplining, spanking went out the door. All those things that used to be of importance to a family structure and to developing a child, that went out, right? So now you get a whole generation of narcissists who believe that their voice was the most important. They're going to then impute that on their own children. And so at the earliest age,
and make it worse, because
they're going to make it worse, right?
Because first of all, they're going to teach them, you're supposed to be narcissistic. And
they won't say it like that, but yeah.
And no spanking. Well, I mean, they're teaching them to be narcissistic.
Well, the thing was, to a certain degree, our parents told us we are wrong in certain things. So because we assumed we were always right, now we're raising children and we're thinking that our children, I'm speaking generally, of course, our children are the purest form of opinion and of belief. So anything a child says is automatically assumed to be truthful, pure, innocent, and absolute. So when a child says, when a boy says, "I am a girl" at the age of 4 or 5, in the mind of the narcissist millennial parent, they're thinking, I remember when I was a child and I thought I was owed everything, and my parents didn't want to ultimately give me absolute control over my life. So I'm going to allow my child to do that. And so what ends up happening is they end up giving into the foolish and depraved wickedness
And
of their
not only
5-year-old
that,
child.
I think I feel like they more so push it on them instead of saying, "Are you sure? Let's maybe try to be a boy still." But instead, I feel like they go the opposite and they almost force, like, this is a good thing. Now I'm going to buy you all girl things. I'm going to force you to be a girl now. And it's just,
Well, there's a reason.
sad.
There's a reason why in the book of Proverbs, Solomon talks about the fool all the time, and the fool is the youthful kid who doesn't take the advice of a father or the advice of the mother, because children are foolish, depraved monsters, and if we don't discipline them in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and we just say, well, since you're a child and you're not influenced by outside society as much yet, your thoughts and your feelings are pure. Those are just pure feelings. And that's a fundamental denial of the nature of depravity and of sin. So to do away with it and say, you're just a pure, innocent child, that comes from a place of truthfulness, and nothing is corrupting that.
I don't
That's a
understand
poor
it because
anthropological view.
we know that feelings come and go all the time.
Right.
I mean, growing up, you like, for example, me, I could have liked one boy one week. The next week, I liked another boy.
Right.
The following week, nowadays.
Which was normal in middle school
it's
and elementary
normal.
school.
So at this age, to think
Yeah.
like, hey, they feel like the boy feels like a girl, and it's just like, that's just a feeling. It can go away. A lot of the times it can have to do with, because let's say I'm a boy and my mother is missing,
Yeah.
so I want to be a girl or whatever. It can have something to do with so many different things that they see on TV nowadays, also
Right.
things that they hear at school. They're constantly being brainwashed with a bunch of different things, but you're not going to cave into absolutely every little thing that they feel.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's continue on with the video.
From the age of 7 years old, right? Working with those hormones, from that age, right? They're not going to have, their body situation is going to be very different than the one that you postulated, right? I also know from my trans friends that the effects that the hormones have on your body are like really profound, really, really profound. Like we're not
And how sad and how dangerous it is to give that to a 7-year-old. Remember, I asked you a question. To a certain degree, what is it that's nature versus nurture when it comes to the transgender sentiments of a child? What is it that brings about that sentimentality of a child that says, I think I'm a girl if it's a boy, and I think I'm a boy if it's a girl? Where does it come from? I think partly it's nurture and mostly or entirely nature. So from the nature of the human condition, that they're born in sin, that feeling of saying, I think I'm a girl, that's a depraved and twisted reality that's already laying in the heart of the child.
And it usually, for sometimes it just has to do with the fact that they admire their mother. I see my son watching me all the time, my 3-year-old son, and he watches me get ready. And as soon as I'm finished, or even before I'm finished, he walks in and tells me, oh, mommy, you're so beautiful. He sees me putting my makeup on. He starts going through my makeup. Those are just natural things. He sees me doing these things, so he's curious about it. He admires me. If one day he told me, I think I'm a girl, I would tell him, no, you just admire me. It is okay to admire women.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you are one.
Right. And our boy has playfully put on dresses, and we'll tell him like, dresses are for girls,
and he realizes that.
He realizes that. Yeah.
He's like, oh, never mind, and he'll tell me, no, I'm not a girl.
But in today's culture, to even admit that, it's considered child abuse.
Yeah.
Because the culture says, no, you should allow that child, that boy, to wear the dress and put on the makeup and grow his hair out long and do all these things so that he can start transitioning into a girl if that's what he wants to be. And that's because culture is dictating to the parents how they should train their children. And it's going to come to a point where Christian families are going to be persecuted for raising their children to not adopt this worldview and to not to give into this worldview.
I mean, up until this point, we've already seen that they have passed a law saying that we can't even biblically counsel anybody who believes to be of a different gender. We can't biblically counsel them and tell them that that is incorrect. They were born a boy, they should be a boy, or they were born a girl, they should be a girl, because you could already go to prison for it.
Yeah, and so the Christian must ask themselves to a certain degree, at what point will we as Christians civilly disobey for the sake of Christ and for the sake of the gospel? Because that's what it ultimately will come to. Is if the state is saying to you, you cannot raise your children this way, you must allow them to give in to the depravity of their hearts. At what point will the Christian say, not in my house, and you can take away my freedom, you can fine me, you can take my children, but I will not bow the knee to Caesar. And that's the kind of persecution that the early church had to face. And we have been so blessed in the United States to not have to undergo that kind of persecution at state level, that we're probably now going to start seeing the results of this. And we have to prepare ourselves.
Yeah.
To a surprising degree, right? And so, I have, look, if the question is, how does a person who starts taking hormones at a particular age, right? How does their body change, and how does that affect vis-a-vis athletic performance? I don't know. We're in such new territory here, right?
Yeah, we certainly are, and we just scratched upon the idea of kids transitioning at a very early age. I mean, there's been more scientific evidence that points that if kids don't do that, then when they wanted to be trans at an early age, they just become gay men, and that there's nothing wrong with that either.
Again, he's not the voice of reason. There is something wrong with that. It goes contrary to the commandments of God, and as Christian families. Now, again, this is the topic of transgenderism and the church. Let's just put it out there. Christians within the church, you must never, ever, ever allow your children to transition, and you must never teach that homosexuality is okay.
But even with his statement right there, what I would understand is that they wanted to become a woman when they were little, but when they became older, they realized, I don't want to be a woman. I'm okay with being a man who's gay. And that's honestly the reality for a lot of people, that they thought that they wanted to be a specific gender, and because they transitioned at such a young age, they regret it. Yeah. Because that's not truly what they wanted. They didn't know what they want. They were just too little to know. So at least that's what I understand. I don't know if that's what you get from that.
From what I understand, this is what he's saying. I think this is what he's saying. He's saying, look, to give children, what's happening with children who are transitioning at an early age, what's happening is most of them who are doing this, if they're prevented from not taking hormone blockers, they just end up becoming homosexuals because they have this sexual confusion going on, and this sexual confusion is kind of spilling into gender confusing. So so let's take a little boy, for example. If a little boy in their mind is gay, that sexual confusing is spilling into him, and he thinks, well, if I'm attracted to boys, that must mean that I'm a girl. So if you don't give that little boy hormone blockers, eventually he gets to a point where he can rationally make the decision, I guess I'm just a gay man. But
That's why I'm saying. So for the most part, they don't really want to transition. They just realize they like a person from the same sex.
Yes. According to this perspective. To our perspective, that's just the depravity of the heart.
I mean, it's still depravity, but what I'm saying is that for the most part, they realize I didn't really want to transition. I just didn't understand what I was feeling.
Right.
And that was just the sexual attraction for the same sex as me.
And the studies have shown that giving children hormone blockers just messes with their biological development so much that it ends up affecting their psychological development, which leads to higher suicide rates, which leads to higher mental disorders and mental
that's
psychological
funny because
disorders.
A lot of the times they say, oh, these transgender kids have like a 50% suicidal rate. But they haven't put the conclusion that maybe, just maybe, it's because they're taking hormones in order to suppress their
they wouldn't
hormones.
They would never do a study like that
They would
because
never.
they don't want to go contrary to the narrative.
Instead, they blame it on bullying and saying they are committing suicide because they're being bullied. And it's just like, no, psychologically, they're not okay.
What ends up happening is because God created them to be male and female, God created them from the beginning to be male and right, your soul is going to be in anguish, which is going to affect your mind. Yeah. And so, but we have that theological and philosophical worldview that allows us to make sense of this in a real way. In their perspective, because it's just evolutionary biology, all of this is just a social construct anyways. And what you're going to hear in a little bit is Joe Rogan again. He brings up a good point, but he says, why if a boy is a girl, why give them hormone blockers anyways? Why are you going to do that? Why are you going to try to force them to become the cultural norm of a girl? Right?
Exactly.
If it's just a cultural construct, a social construct, why do that anyways? Why not just let him be a man who transitions into a woman later, because it doesn't matter.
If he truly wants to be a woman later on, he's not going to change his mind.
And listen, we're not saying that this is what we believe. We're just laying out for you what the world, how the world is talking about this. And we're not going to go through the whole video because it's a pretty lengthy video.
But that's why I'm saying, like, to me, it's upsetting that you're basically doing this to your children. And in my mind, for example, if my child was to say that, I would say, not in my house. You're not doing that. If you ever decide to do that when you're older, then you go ahead and you do that when you're older. You're out of my house, but you're not doing that when you're little.
As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so that means that if my child at the age of 10 comes to me and says, I think I am a gay man, I will say, I'm going to pray for you. We're going to get you counseling. I'm going to counsel my child if it comes to that. If they say to me, if my daughter comes to me, I think I'm a boy, I will pray for them. I will get them counseling. I will share the gospel with them. And if they continue in that sin until they're 18 and they leave the house and then they decide to do that on their own, then that's between them and the Lord. But I am not responsible for my child after that. Before that, I will not allow that to take place in my house. And the Christian must be willing to stand firm in that decision, contrary to the social and state legislative norms. If the law comes out later, which this is what we're getting at in society, legislation is going to dictate to parents that they cannot do this. It hasn't become law yet.
Thank God.
Right now, it's just a cultural, social phenomenon that's taking place, which is putting pressure on Christians, putting pressure on those who have a biblical worldview, that they have to adopt this or else they're getting in the way of progressivism. But if it comes to a point where legislation is mandated of us to allow our children to be that way and to do anything to prevent that through counseling or therapy or anything else is against the law, then we as Christians must go against the civil legislation. It is better to listen to God than to man. and that may mean that you may be persecuted. So
There's no reason to give kids hormones, and there's no reason to decide before a person's frontal lobe is completely fully developed, which doesn't even take place till like 25. People don't know who they are. A 7-year-old, you won't even. People don't even give their 7-year-old phones. You don't let them vote. You're going to let them decide what sex they're going to be for the rest of their life.
The research that I've seen, and again, I'm not an expert on this, and you know, I'd love to. This is a conversation. This is something I'd love to talk about on our show, and I'd specifically love, you know, this is the kind of topic where I really want to make sure that I know the research and that I'm, you know, also speaking to trans folks, you know, in this conversation. But so to touch on just what I've, you know, my own experience and the research I've seen. The research I've seen is that trans kids from a young age, they are incredibly consistent in when they're expressing their gender identity.
Why are they consistent? Again, this idea of nature and nurture. He's saying they're consistent. Why are they being taught this? If they are being taught this, then most likely what's happening is that teaching is going to lay root in the depraved heart of the child, which is then going to flower into this corrupted sin.
I mean, we've even seen certain celebrities that have babies and they don't even want to put a gender to their child, and they said, "Who am I to decide the gender for my child? I'm gonna let my child grow in whatever gender
that's
they decide
ridiculous.
to be."
Yeah,
and it's like, what?
yeah.
Are you kidding me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so, yes,
I mean,
nature.
yeah, nature, yes, but
And nurture.
for sure. There's a lot of people, even Christians. I can't wrap my head around this, but there are even Christians that say that the belief of a child is purer than a 40-year-old Christian who's been a Christian for 30 plus years or something like that.
I mean, to a certain degree, when you share the gospel to a child, they're able to better understand it quicker, I think, because
again, it's not that they understand it. It's that as a child, they don't know. And so they can be, in a sense, rightly brainwashed in the word,
yes,
washed in the gospel. And so that lays a foundation.
Yeah, but somebody who's lived life and has seen the horrific things that can happen in this world, it's harder for that person to understand how a mighty God could come and save them and rise.
Well, let's take this for example. You take a child. If you take a child who is, let's say, 6 years old in a Christian family, they're taught the gospel, they're taught the tenets of the faith, they're taught to fear the Lord, they're taught the scriptures, they're taught everything right. Yes, that is the grace of God towards that child in the raising of the child in a Christian home. But you take that same child, you put them in a Muslim family. Those teachings are going to lay root just as powerfully as those Christian teachings would have.
Absolutely, it is. I've seen videos of anti-Christian people going to places where there's a preacher preaching, open air preaching the gospel, and I've seen those kids openly cursing and throwing stuff at the preacher and speaking horrible things that I wouldn't even ever dare say to anybody or think.
8, 9, 10 years old.
Even younger than that.
Even younger.
Learning
Learning to spit on them.
Yeah.
Learning to yell at them. Learning to cuss at them.
Yes.
And that's because the parents taught them. And then you take that same child and you put them in an environment where transgenderism and sexual fluidity is okay, and your own relative worldview is what defines you ultimately. Then, what's going to end up happening is they're going to say, yeah, I'm a girl.
Yeah,
or yeah, I'm a boy.
We're at an age where it's not even for example, a boy says he wants to be a girl. They're applauded.
Yeah.
They're applauded at this
So
time.
that's only going to assert that all the more powerfully in the heart of the child.
They're more proud of me as a girl than I am as a boy, so obviously I want to be a girl then.
Right. Perfect.
Okay, but that's a big generalization. You're talking about a lot of human beings.
Yeah, but
that's fits this narrative by saying they're incredibly consistent. But like, if you polled these people, like, what are you talking about? Like, if you,
I mean, that's I don't have the research in front of me that I saw, so I can't like go into the details on it. But like, yeah, it was research that was surveying and tracking like trans kids who declared their identity from a young age. Did it change? The answer was generally no, it really didn't. I have a friend who has a trans kid. Don't know the kid's exact age, but we're in the age range that we're talking about. And he's explained that like, well, my child from a very young age consistently like said, I am a girl, like, and has never contradicted themselves, never changed their mind. And so the humane thing and
I can just imagine that scenario when the little boy comes up to the parents and says, "Hey, Mom, I think I'm a girl," and I can just imagine the mom saying, "Yeah, honey, you can be whatever you want to be. You think you're a girl? That's great." And that only reaffirms and asserts the notion that that little boy really thinks that. So of course they're going to remain consistent. They're going to return back to the mom and say, "Hey, Mom, I really do think that I'm a girl." And the mom's going to be like, "Yeah, that's great. So what can I do to help you?" And
I just don't understand this whole teaching your children contrary to fact. Because if my child or any child was to come up to you and tell you, "Hey, Mom, I think 3 + 3 is 9." I don't think any parent would be like, "Oh my gosh, you're so smart. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, good for you.
Good. That's awesome." They would be like, "No."
They're going to be like, "You're not going to get in college like that."
Yeah, no. Go back and study because 3 + 3 = 6, not 9, honey.
Well, again, when you only adopt a evolutionary biological worldview and claim that science is the justification for your entire worldview, then the scientific method becomes God. And if the scientific method fails to provide a moral worldview, then that cannot give a justification for believing that being male is a moral good if you're a male.
Well, yeah, I understand that because
cetera.
they separated God from science and they said, no, it's completely different. And now they've deviated even from science. Science does not matter anymore to them.
Well, the whole purpose of the Christian worldview is that it justifies for us having a moral position. The reason we can say that it's a moral good for men to be men and women to be women is because God established it that way. In the evolutionary biological worldview or in the natural materialist worldview, morality is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if all of this is just a social construct. If these ideas of what a male is and what a female is, all it is just the development of evolutionary process, and it has no real foundation in creating a moral worldview, then 3 + 3 can be 6. But to be a man becoming a woman, that's okay because that's not necessarily scientific fact. That's more
technically it is scientific fact because you can never take the man out of a man.
Biologically speaking.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is why this position is inconsistent. It's an inconsistent worldview because on one hand they're saying science is the final authority, and then you say, well, science says males are born with a chromosome and women are born with specific chromosomes. Males are born with specific body parts, genitalia, that's different than women who can develop breasts and have children. And there's these absolute biological differences between these two. And they say, no. they just deny it.
Saying, which it doesn't make sense because even in the science world, that is fact.
Right.
Those are facts.
Yeah,
and they deny that.
Going to do as a parent was to like embrace that choice on his child's part, right? And yeah, that's
embrace that choice, meaning hormonally.
I shouldn't even phrase it as a choice, like embrace that identity.
See, they can't even be consistent with their own language. Embrace that choice. I shouldn't say it's a choice because it's not a choice in their worldview. Embrace that identity. So that language fundamentally changes everything because they can't even be consistent with their own words. So how can they expect others to be consistent with their words?
But it is a choice, right? I mean, if you're choosing to add hormones to a child's body, that's a choice.
It's a choice
blockers.
it's a choice on the part of the parent. It's not a choice on the part of the child to like in the same way that being gay isn't a choice. Yeah.
Okay, but if that's who they are, if they think that they're a girl, why do you have to give them hormones to make them more of a girl?
Because I'm sorry, can you expand on the question?
It's a legitimate
It's a simple question. If you say that the child thinks it's a girl, so you're going to give the child hormones. If the child thinks it's a girl, let it be a girl. Like you don't have. Why are you adding hormones? If you're shooting hormones into a child, and you're affecting the child's development, you're saying that's not a choice. That's nonsense. Of course, it's a choice. You're choosing to chemically change this child's body. You're choosing to inject things into this child's body on a regular basis that are going to radically affect the physical development of their body.
Yeah.
All right. So I think that's pretty much, you get the idea. The rest of the clip, you can probably just click on the link that I'm going to attach to the description of the video. And if you want to finish it, then you can finish it. So we'll wrap it up on that part because it's gonna bleed over into a bunch of other things. This video will be extremely long. But I think it's a valid point that he makes, at least for their worldview. For the Christian worldview, absolutely not.
Obviously.
Absolutely not. But it's
Obviously,
a proper question.
But I think for somebody who is so liberal, the fact that he thinks that way is pretty awesome because he's thinking of it as, he says he's a girl. Why are you trying to change him? Why are you trying to change who he is? Changing the outward appearance isn't going to change who he says he already is.
Right. Again, I mean, the reason we wanted to play this video is so that we can show you how the world talks about this position. So now I'm going to go to an article that I found on the Gospel Coalition, and it's a good article. It talks about different aspects of this phenomenon, I guess you can call it, but it really is just sin and depravity. So it starts with the this landmark decision on the Boy Scouts allowing girls to be part of the Boy Scouts and getting rid of the boy and just calling it Scouts or something like that. Or Scouts of America or something like that.
Well, I thought because I thought they're already allowing boys to be part of the Girl Scouts.
Well, that was the thing, is that they're not. They're only allowing girls to be part of the Boy Scouts. And so there was this huge debacle going over because Boy Scouts was really a conservative thing for a long time. It was to show boys how to become boys, to do boy things outdoors, and also to show girls how to do those similar things in a girl context. So that's why you had Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, et cetera, et cetera. So he has some pretty good things, but I wanted to go through these key terms and kind of define them because what ended up happening is there's now this divide between the previous generation and this now newer generation of believers, or excuse me, of just this newer generation of millennials and etc. There's a divide in the language that's being used, and baby boomers and Gen Xers don't know what's happening because millennials and those younger are using the same words that they would have used, but with a completely different meaning. So they'll say something, and the baby boomers and the Gen Xers will think, yeah, yeah, sure, I know what you're talking about. But they don't really know what they're talking about because they've changed everything. Postmodernism has redefined everything. All the meanings of words have been redefined. So he starts off with biological sex, birth sex, or natal sex. That's the sex that you are assigned when you're at birth, right? So based upon usually your genitalia. Yeah, your genitalia. You look at it and it's like, oh, that's a boy. You know, it's pretty obvious that's a boy, and for a girl that's pretty obvious it's a girl. And we'll get into the topic of hermaphrodites in a little bit, because there are those rare occasions where the child is born with an ambiguous genitalia. You're like, well, what is this? Is they can either have a deformity in that area, or they can have what seems like both, anatomically both organs at the same time. And so in those cases, what are we supposed to do? But I just wanted to point out these different things. So gender historically was used to define the same thing as sex.
Yeah. So basically what you were born with, that's what your gender was.
Right. So when you fill out an application, when it says, what is your gender or what is your sex? You already know, male or female. In the postmodernistic society, gender and sex are completely separate. Sex is the thing that is defined biologically by your chromosome or at birth. Gender is the thing that you create in your own mind.
You identify as.
Yeah, the thing that you identify as. And then your sexuality is something different than your gender. Which
everything is different, basically.
Everything is different. Everything. Because you can be a transsexual transgender pansexual, which for most people they'd be like, what does that even mean?
It would be somebody who has transitioned, who has an open relation, like they can basically like anybody, and it's okay for them, not for me.
Yes. So that's exactly right. Or they can be even other things, like they can be pixie gender. Have you ever heard of that, pixie gender?
Isn't that basically like I can identify as whoever I want if I want to be a
No.
girl today?
No, they identify as a pixie,
I know, but what would that be considered?
like a fairy, like a little pixie
oh
fairy,
my gosh,
like Tinkerbell.
I was gonna go with that first, but I thought that would be
Exactly.
ridiculous.
But that's the ridiculousness of this, is that it can be an infinite amount of choices. So the next one would be a gender identity. This refers to the way individuals perceive themselves. Again, so even though you're assigned a sex, and that sex and the gender are supposed to be synonymous with one another, in the postmodernistic perspective, gender identity is the thing in which you perceive yourself. So if you're born a male, and you're assigned a male, meaning that at the point of birth they recognize you're anatomically a male. It's irrelevant when it comes to your own identity, because you can identify as whatever you want, and it can be an infinite amount of identities. And then there's gender expression, and his definition is this refers to the psychological and social aspects of how masculinity and femininity are presented in things like dress and demeanor and social roles and conventions and other cultural genders. So you can have, for example, a male who was born a male, and then they can identify as a female, and they can choose whether or not they want to dress as a male or dress as a female, take on role as a male or roles as a female. And so you have a multiplicity, a multivariate variety of whatever you want to be. You can be a man who identifies as a woman who dresses as a child, a woman child, and take on the social behaviors of a little girl. And that would be your gender role, but your gender expression is girl, but your gender identity is male. So it's a overwhelming, confusing thing, okay? And that's for those who adhere to the gender binary, meaning you adhere to either the male or the female aspects. Now, there's a gender bending. This refers to the intentional crossing or bending or blending of accepted gender norms in a given culture. So what ends up happening is you can become both at the same time and say, I don't identify as either one. I identify as nothing, or a they, or a Z, or a zer, or or a her or whatever.
They or them or
Yeah, so you end up adopting something different than what males and female is. So I was explaining that so you can be assigned a sex, that gender can be synonymous with sex. However, your identity can be the thing that you have perceived yourself to be. So even though you're born a male, you can perceive yourself to be a female. But then there's gender expression, which is how you express, how you view that
Sexually.
role. No, not sexually. Just how do you view that masculinity? How do you view that femininity? So you take on certain characteristics and certain traits. So what you'll see with males when they become women is they'll adopt feminine traits.
Oh yeah.
And then they express themselves.
And they're like super exaggerated.
Yeah.
It's not even like a woman would react if it's like exaggerating the female role.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's that expression. And there's certain things culturally that are imposed upon masculinity and femininity that I don't agree with. Like saying that men must behave in certain ways, or that men cannot behave in certain ways because that makes them less masculine. Like, let's say if a man is more artistic, more expressive, more sentimental, and not so aggressive. In the view of culture, that's not a man. And I don't agree with that notion.
I don't either.
Because that man can take on Christ and be a man of the gospel and of the kingdom. And maybe he is a little bit more sentimental. Maybe he is a little bit more artistic. Maybe he is not so aggressive. Maybe he is not so powerful in the sense of athleticism and strength. And yet that man is a man in the eyes of God. And the same thing with women. You know, there are women who are a lot more emotional, who are a lot more artistic, who are a lot more nurturing, and there's other women who are a lot more logical, and a lot more rational in their way of thinking, and they don't express their feelings as much. That doesn't make them less women. That's just, it's a spectrum of all different kinds of women, but they're women nonetheless. And so imposing on women and men certain cultural tendencies that are contrary to biblical explanations of what a man and a woman is, I think is not correct for us to
I
adopt.
think that's funny because we see a lot of the times, for example, women don't want to be told how women should be. Because, like you're saying, it is true. We can look like women on the outside, but on the inside, we're still going to be different.
Oh, yeah.
So different. But when you see a man transition into a woman, you always see them act. They always act the same. And it's always an exaggerated way that they speak and the way that they walk and the way, like, just everything. It just points to this is the way the woman is. And they always dress really girly. And I'm like, not all women are like that. Why do men perceive when they transition to women that women, this is what a woman is, or vice versa? When you see a girl transition to be a man, you always see them try to be super macho, super aggressive, and I'm just like,
They adopt stereotypical.
Yes, and not all
yeah.
men are like that.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And unfortunately, because we've equated cultural norms to biblical norms, we've ill-defined what a man is and ill-defined what a woman is in the church. And that needs to go away. That needs to go away. And we need to define men as men and realize that there are different kinds of men, but that those men are men irregardless, and that there are different kinds of women, but that those women are women irregardless. So that's what expression is expressing those characteristics and those traits. Gender roles. So that's sorry, no, that was roles. Gender bending is when you don't even identify with either or you call gender fluidity, is when you can be male one minute, you can be female in the next minute, or you can be neither the next minute. So you can be anything that you want to be at any given moment. at any given time. And what we're seeing here in the millennial generation with this postmodernistic idea is that because gender is a social construct, then you should give in to the demands of the gender confused person when they say, call me his or zer or higher or whatever they want to be called, because that's what they've adopted for themselves. And what ends up happening is when you go against that narrative, you find yourself on the outside. You become an other. You become an enemy. And so that can become dangerous very quickly. Then there's gender dysphoria.
Which is all of it.
Pretty much, yeah.
Which is all of it.
It's pretty much a way of saying you're disillusioned with the whole concept of gender. And so here it says gender identity disorder, which saw the mismatch itself as a psychiatric disorder. Now, however, it's the only distress that is normally caused by gender incongruence that is regarded as a problem, not the incongruence itself. For this reason, I will use the term gender dysphoria only occasionally in this essay, and for the most part for the language of gender incongruence, which I deem to be a more helpful descriptor of the condition. And then there's intersex. This is a term that covers a range of disorders of sex development where there is some biological ambiguity in a person's genitalia or gonads. That means more like hermaphrodites, which I guess that's not technically a politically correct term anymore. You're supposed to call them intersex. You're not supposed to call them hermaphrodites anymore. So intersex would be the more politically correct word. Transgender, which is those who are transitioning from one gender to the next. Heteronormativity, again, these are probably words that nobody's ever heard about. But
some of them I've never heard about.
So heteronormativity is the idea that that a male must be attractive to females. That's heteronormativity. So
it would be us.
Yeah. And because I'm a heteronormative male and you're a heteronormative female.
Actually put that, like actually identify as that, because that would have been considered the normal.
Well, the thing is, we don't have to. What's happening is in our culture is they're demanding that we adopt these labels.
That we have to now identify as whatever the hetero norm.
According to the transgender community or to the progressive community, I am a cisgender heteronormative male. Okay? Meaning, a cisgender meaning I was born a male, I identify as a male, I have the characteristics of a male, I have no fluidity whatsoever, I'm cisgender. So the thing I was born is the thing I identify, is the thing that I express, is the thing that I live by. And you're a cisgendered female. And we're heteronormative because we don't have homosexual tendencies. We have lived according to the sex and the gender that we have been that we were born with. Yeah, because we're not given that. It's just identified. Yeah, born. It's just like, hey, that's what you are. That's what you were born with. And so, but there's that specific, which I believe is the God ordained way of understanding gender and sex and things like that, and that is males are males, females are females. They're born that way. They express themselves that way. They take on the roles that way. They have the characteristics and the traits that way, according to the biological makeup that God created them to be. And everything outside of that is sin. Everything outside of that is sin. And the Christian cannot give in to the demands of culture. So if you have an opportunity to read this, it's a lengthy thing, but it's very, very informative. I really enjoyed it. It helped to, it really does clarify
to understand
things.
Them. That doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with them.
Right.
It just informs you of the craziness going on in this world.
All right, just to finish off, we'll listen to a podcast question from John Piper. I like how he answers this.
A very common question we receive is reflected in a question from a podcast listener named Ruth, who asked this. Pastor John, how should we respond when LGBT friends want us to refer to them by a different opposite gender name? Like when a female asks everyone to now call her by a male name. Should we call them by that male name? Samantha likewise asks this in light of the Bruce Jenner interview and other celebrities pushing the LGBT agenda. How should a Christian treat a person who identifies under one of these labels? Should I treat a transgender person as the gender they choose or the one they were born with? Pastor John, help us with these questions.
Before I give 3 guidelines that I thought of that would guide behavior in specific response to those questions, I really do need to lay the foundations here, because we're assuming some things that would not be assumed by a lot of people, and we need to give an account for why we assume them. I'm going to assume, I'm going to try to argue for now, biblically, that gender, even though the world considers it distinct from sex, for the Christian should be in sync with the biological genetic sex, and there are biblical reasons for that.
So just to start off, he says, gender and sex are not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm. So he's basically saying you should recognize them by what they are.
Correct. Yes, a male is a male and a
not
female
what
is a
they
female.
identify as.
Right. Yes.
Manhood and womanhood are understood and intended in the Bible, that is, intended by God, our Creator, as biologically or genetically. Of course, the biblical authors didn't know anything about genetics, but I'm throwing it in because we do, and it's in sync with biology, which they did know. They're assuming, the biblical writers are intending and assuming that our sex is biologically or genetically identified. There is vastly more to the meaning of manhood and womanhood than biology and genetics in the way we relate to each other, but not less. In other words, manhood and womanhood are glorious, personal realities that transcend genetics and biology, but are never intended to be severed from biology. And one of the clearest ways to see this in the Bible is that there are so many references to male child or female child. I did this.
I think what he says here is really important. I think you want to take the time to expound upon that just a little bit. He says the biological makeup of a male and a female transcends the biological, though it does not sever it. What do you think he means by that? Because I have an idea what I think he means by that.
I think he's basically saying it goes beyond just the physical appearance of it.
Yes.
It has to do with emotional, psychological, not physical, but basically our feelings and our emotions and our drive and everything that is within, not just the body. So it extends past just the physical part of it, and they should never, ever be severed. You can't ever separate your mind from your body.
Yes, I think that's true. But even the mind and the chemical makeup and your emotions, to a certain degree, are linked biologically.
Soul.
Yeah, soul. Yes. So that's what I think he was trying to get at. Because if men and women are made in the image of God, then fundamentally, inherently, who they are, even in their soul, is
that's what
male
we
or
are.
female. That's what you are.
And you can't ever separate it.
Yeah, because I truly believe that in the kingdom, in the everlasting kingdom in the future, you will be a female and I will be a male.
Yeah, absolutely.
That won't change just because we're glorified. We may be asexual, meaning we may not be sexual beings anymore because you won't be given away in marriage. I won't be given away in marriage anymore. But regardless, we will be identified as male, female, even in the kingdom, and so I think that's a really important thing for him to say. Is I think a lot of Christians are guilty of this. Is they try to base the femaleness and the maleness of each person based upon their biological makeup, and not based upon the reality that they're made in the image of God, male and female. And that reality as being made male in the image of God and female in the image of God transcends any biological foundation.
You know, that's crazy that you say that, because a lot of the times we're outraged by the fact that they want to change their physical appearance,
Right.
not realizing that they have already tried to change their soul and their inner being.
Well, it's not that they try to change it, it's that it's already fundamentally corrupted because of sin.
But they're accepting it. They're already changing themselves,
I see.
who they are within, which is worse.
With that being said, that doesn't negate the value of their existence as a man
No,
or a woman,
absolutely.
just because they've decided to live in this sinful way. I think that, and we'll talk about it a little bit more here in a second, but I think this will also lend to this idea of the intersex or the hermaphrodite. Is that when somebody is born with the biological makeup of two sexes, when they have the anatomical makeup of two sexes in the genital region, how do we determine what they should be? And if they're raised in the fear and admonition of the Lord, through prayerful consideration, through counseling, through
In that scenario, do you think that you should allow them to just grow up and then whatever they decide to be?
No, I think because we can determine the sex based upon chromosomal, or based upon the chromosome.
So basically,
We should be able to
you
use
should-
biological makeup.
So you should
to
be able
determine.
to determine it by their blood, what they are.
And based upon that, that will be confirmed in their soul, because they're created in the image of God. And that reality of them either being male or female, regardless of what's happening down there, that will manifest itself because they're being trained and they're being raised in the fear and admonition of the Lord. But again, that's in the Christian context. So when it comes to a non-Christian context, we as Christians need to be extremely careful with how we confront the unbeliever with that reality.
Looked them up just to make sure. This is so obvious that people wonder, why are you even arguing? But we need to. In other words, before children were old enough to express any gender-specific behaviors or desires or preferences, they were identified as male and female. And this identity defined their lives. For example, sometimes in matters of inheritance and other ways. There is no thought in the Bible of the possibility that the sex biologically identified could change because of its rooting in biology. And when Genesis 1:27 therefore says God created us male and female, there is every reason to think that this included our biological genetic nature at the root of all the other transcendent aspects of male and female personhood. So we have a pervasive biblical warrant to say that God wills for our sexual identity to be one, to be of one piece with our biological genetic identity. Now that's my biblical premise. And let me just mention an exception. We all know that there are very, very rare situations of heartbreaking biological anomalies where the anatomical sexual organs are ambiguous or compromised. In those cases, we face very unusual challenges. And if I were a parent, and a child was born in that situation, I think I would ask for, which you couldn't do generations ago, genetic testing, and opt for surgery that suits the child best for what his genetics say he or she is, and then raise him or her with that expectation.
Yeah, I think that's wise. Yes, it's true. Science doesn't have all the answers, but it can give us some answers, and that can really help to alleviate the difficulties when it comes to that specific rare instance of when a child is born with the anatomically ambiguous area, you know. So I think what he says is absolutely true, and I mean, it's so rare, I've never heard of it, and I don't know anybody. And for those cases that are, we just want to say, our prayers are for you, and if you're looking to raise your child rightly in the fear of God, then do so based upon primarily the biological makeup of that child, ensuring that surgery is taking place so that child is raised in the way that God intended them to be. Because
and
even
so that way it can be as normal as possible.
Yeah, because just because sin has affected the biological and anatomical aspect of it, that doesn't mean that they're not made in the image of God, or that there's some kind of, I don't know, anomaly or something like that. And God was like, well, I didn't intend for that to happen, right?
Well, no, I mean, because then it's saying that you would have to go along and say, like, anybody with any sort of abnormality was not made in the image of God, and that's not true.
Right. Yeah.
But that is very, very rare. And we are talking mainly here about clearly identifiable sexual organs at birth and through life that should define the trajectory of the sexual and gender life and understanding. Now, how does all that play out in culture where there is an increasingly aggressive effort to force all of us to treat so-called sex change surgeries as really changing the sex of a person, or even short of surgery? We're being asked in Minnesota to treat boys as girls who want to be treated as girls, and vice versa, so that it determines what team they play on in high school, the girls' team or the boy team, and what locker room they use and what restrooms they use. And as Ruth said, who asked this question, we're being asked to call Bob, Mary, and Sally, Jim. And this will make obedience to Jesus in the coming days increasingly costly for us. So now finally, here are my 3 guidelines. Number 1, in one sense, the names Sally or Jim are culturally arbitrary. And we can name our kids whatever we want. We can name them after cars, or planets, or Greek virtues, or grandma. And calling someone by that arbitrary name that their parents may have chosen or they may choose halfway through life may not imply agreement with all that name was created to signify by the person. So if I had a neighbor next door to me, which is very feasible, who was biologically male and everybody knew it, and he introduced himself to me as Sally, I met him for the first time and I saw him the next day, I might avoid calling him anything, but I would probably default to Sally. I probably would, until there was a relationship that would go deeper to see whether I could be of any help. So that's one concession I'm going to make because of the arbitrary nature of names. And then it's going to get a little more dicey and divisive.
All right. So his first point is names are culturally ambiguous in a sense that people take on the name of anything in this culture. Names don't really have meaning as they did before, especially in our culture. So names can mean anything. You can take any item and add a suffix to it or a prefix to it, and it becomes a name, you know, or you just add a vowel to the end of it and that becomes the name or something like that. So his point, and though I've never been put in a situation like that, His point was, if I was introduced to a stranger who I knew was a man, and he said, "My name is Sally," he would said, "I'll call him Sally," because there's girls that have what seems like boy names, and there's boys that seem like they have girls' names. Because there's guys out there whose names are Leslie, right?
Yeah.
And there's girls out there whose names are like Alex.
Well, I mean, I've met boys and girls with the name Alexis
yeah,
or the name Taylor
or Robin.
or Robin.
Mm-hmm.
So there's names that are for both.
Yeah, yeah.
But,
And so what we would think, well, that's a culturally girl name. Well, that's really irrelevant because that's the name he is telling you it is. So when it comes to a stranger, or even someone you may technically know a little bit better than a stranger, if they're saying, "This is my name," he's saying, "I would use that name," and I think I would use that name too. Even though if in the back of my head I knew this guy is wanting to be a girl, his name is too feminine. He's not a Jennifer, right? Like that's not a culturally ambiguous name. That's blatantly he's wanting to be a female. Even in the back of my mind, I'm thinking I know that's what he's doing, but he wants me to call him Jennifer. I'll probably call him Jennifer. Until I think what John Piper said is a relationship is developed to the point where maybe I can have somewhat of an influence in the way that person is thinking. Then there might be an opportunity for reassessment of how I want to talk to that person, because that could be an opportunity for the gospel. And when you're preaching the gospel, and after you're going to want to be more faithful to the gospel than to the realities of that person's own imaginations. And that's something that every person has to wrestle with. What do you think?
I think that I've come to a conclusion doing studies and talking to people over the years that I've come to the realization that you can't force people to follow the Bible if they're not saved primarily. So even if I met that person, I wouldn't be able to tell them, "Hey, you're a man.
Right.
You should call yourself a man name," because he's not following Christ. So I can't have him follow Christ or do things that Bible says if he's not firstly following Christ. So firstly, my job would be to share the gospel with that person and go from there. And if I start off by saying, "I'm not going to call you Sally," or whatever, or whatever name he used,
Right.
then that's just going to shut down that relationship right then and there. And I'm not going to have that opportunity to ever share the gospel with him.
Right. Yes.
Number 2, however, if in the office where we worked, I was compelled to identify every so-called transgendered person by the pronoun they preferred in all of my emails or conversations. Suppose in the emails and conversations I had to use she for a he or he for a she, or I'd get disciplined in the office. At that point, I would say to my superiors, I cannot treat he's as she's and she's as he's. I cannot buy the whole package. I would be lying. I would be lying to call a he a she. I'm not lying to call a male Sally. That's a culturally arbitrary, weird fluke. But I'm lying if I say about a true Jim who wants to be called Sally, she. And it would be contrary to my understanding of sexuality, and I would start looking for another job. Third.
All right. Good point. I think he was spot on that. And his point is this: as soon as your speech is being compelled to go against the very conscience that God designed for you to have, in light of His authoritative word, that's when we have to stand for what is true. Because there's a difference between culturally ambiguous terms, and they fundamental aspect where they're forcing you to go against your own belief system and going against the mandated creation of God. So if the state legislates to the country of the United States of America, you must adhere. You must use these terms to address a transgender. You cannot hide behind your religious freedom rights, which is what we're seeing little by little with like the cakes with homosexual marriages and with weddings, and photographers who are saying I can't serve homosexuals because it goes against my religion. They're coming against them with the Supreme Court. Okay. This is where we're heading towards. So if it comes to a point where the state is legislating to Christians, you must say, or you cannot say, things that are contrary to the scripture, then we must at some point civilly disobey for the sake of God and for the gospel. And that will entail that you may lose your freedom. You may lose your rights. You may lose your home. You may lose your job. You may lose your family. And that's not an easy task.
Same thing with regard to bathrooms, locker rooms, hotel rooms, with women who identify as men or vice versa. I would refuse to have a hotel roommate who said she was a man. Even though I share a room in my travels with my assistant all the time, he's a man, and I know he's a man, and that's a perfectly normal thing to do. But if they insisted that I share the same bathroom, share the same locker room, share the same hotel room, I'm looking for another job. So, in summary, then, the question is: Are we forced to call them a name that they prefer, which I'm going to go ahead and probably, in the short run at least, submit to? Or are we forced to identify them as a different sex than they really are? Naming may have a certain ambiguity and arbitrariness to it, but the language of he and she and the use of bathrooms and hotel rooms does not. And I will anyway, draw a line and say, I will not call he, she, I will not call she, he, and I will not intrude on the sexual privacy of a person of the opposite sex or walk into a situation where they would intrude upon mine.
That last point was really important because I think I talked to you a little about this, and we'll wrap it up with this point. To what extent should the church get involved with the political and legislative aspects of this whole transgender movement? And I think you said a good point, is if it came to a point where we can put it for a vote, Christians should en masse go out and vote against it.
Absolutely.
But the way that the culture is headed, most likely it won't be put to a vote. Most likely what will end up happening is there will be an event that will bring about the tragic and horrific death or deaths of people within the transgender community. And what will end up happening is the Supreme Court will get its hands into it, make a decision for the people without asking the people how they would vote on this situation. They will create legislation through the Supreme Court or through executive power. They will pass it. They will enforce it upon us as a totalitarian system that imposes their beliefs on us. And then what will end up happening is we'll be in the same exact situation that we currently are with the homosexual issue. That's what I see happening with that. Because that's pretty much what ended up happening with the homosexual, without so much, without deaths, though. They just did it as a civil rights thing. And they're doing the same thing with the transgender community. They're imposing upon us their belief system. Caesar is compelling us to bow the knee to their perspective on this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be up to the Christian to say, we will not bow the knee. We will not burn incense.
Mm-hmm.
We will not call the state God. We will not obey because God has called us to a higher standard.
Yeah.
Are you ready for that?
Whether I'm ready or not, that's besides the point.
Yes, and I think there's this misconception that persecution is this honorable thing in the Bible, or this honorable thing in history. Every Christian who has died by the hand of the state has died as an enemy of the state in a dishonorable way. The cross was a dishonorable thing.
Getting stoned to death was not honorable at all.
Being burned alive, being eaten by beasts, being imprisoned for life, losing your head, being thrown off cliffs, being dragged to death, being beheaded, whatever the point, however they died, it was not honorable. It was dishonorable to the family. You died as a criminal. You died as an enemy of the state. You died as a persecutor of the progressive system and the powers that be. And we have to be ready for them. And that entails a generation of steady-minded, strong believers. So what kind of children are we going to raise? Are we going to raise children that will adhere to the social and cultural norms? Or will we raise children that would adhere to the fear and admonition of the Lord?
Absolutely.
All right. Any last words?
Prepare yourselves.
Well, I appreciate you all tuning in. Hit the like button, share, subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'll have the links to all the things that I shared, the article, the YouTube videos that I attached on here. I'll also have a link to my YouTube channel, so hit that subscribe button. I appreciate it if you guys shared the word. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time on Reformed Perspective.
Bye.